Hi there, welcome back. So last week we were talking about music and the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment really spurred on the classical movement in Europe. Mainly last week we spoke about the philosophy behind the Enlightenment and sort of how that philosophy was being mirrored in music in some simple ways. This week, we're going to talk a bit more about the features of classical music, from its rhythms to its melodies, and then finally, we're going to think about form. So, let's jump in. In discussing the musical style of the late Baroque period, we started with a single guiding concept. There is a thorough, even rigorous quality in the ways early 18th century composers treated almost all aspects of music, and this quality seems to underpin the expressive gestures of grandeur and overstatement that are characteristic of the Baroque period. Classical music cannot be discussed quite as easily as this. We have to keep two concepts in mind for its understanding. Concepts that were constantly on the lips of men and women of the time. One was natural, as the other was pleasing variety. In the late 18th century, it was taken for granted that these two artistic ideas went hand in hand and provided mutual support. Today we can see that sometimes they pulled in opposite directions. For although variety was involved as a guard against boredom, it was also an invitation to complexity, and complexity would seem to run counter to natural simplicity and clarity. In any case, in classical music, one or the other, and sometimes both, of these qualities can be traced in all the elements of musical technique, in rhythm, dynamics, tone color, melody, texture, and form. A new expressive quality developed in this music as a result of its new technique. Perhaps the most striking change in music between the Baroque and classical periods came in rhythm. In this area, the artistic ideal of pleasing reigned supreme. The unvarying rhythm of Baroque music were regarded as dreary, obvious, and boring. Classical music is highly flexible in rhythm. Throughout a single movement, the tempo and meter remain constant, but the rhythms of the various themes tend to differ in both obvious and subtle ways. In the first movement of Mozart's Symphony in G minor, for example, the first theme moves almost entirely in eighth notes and quarters, whereas the second theme is marked by longer notes and shorter notes, dotted half notes and sixteenths. Audiences wanted variety in music. Composers responded by refining the rhythmic differences between theme and other musical sections so that the differences sound like more than differences. They sound like real contrasts. The music may gradually increase or decrease its rhythmic energy, stop suddenly, press forward by fits and starts, or glide by smoothly. All this gives the sense that classical music is moving in a less predictable, more interesting, and often more exciting way than Baroque music does. Variety and flexibility were also introduced into dynamics. Passages were now conceived more specifically than before as loud, soft, very loud, and so on, and marked with forte, piano, fortissimo, mezzo forte by composers accordingly. Again, concern for variety went along with the new sensitivity to contrast. By insisting on the contrast between loud and soft, soft and very soft, composers made variety and dynamics clearly perceptible and, we must suppose, pleasing. Furthermore, instead of using the steady dynamics of the previous period, composers now worked extensively with gradations of volume. The words for growing louder or crescendo and growing softer, diminuendo, first came into general use in the classical period. Orchestras of the mid-18th century were the first to practice long crescendos, which, we are told, caused audiences to rise up from their seats in excitement. The clearest sign of these flexibility and dynamics was the rise in popularity of the piano at the expense of the omnipresent harpsichord of the Baroque era. The older instrument could manage only one sound level, or at best a few sound levels, thanks to its 2 or 3 separate sets of strings. The new pianoforte, the name means soft loud in Italian, could produce a continuous range of dynamics from soft to loud. It attracted composers because they wished their keyboard instruments to have the same flexibility and dynamics that they were teaching to their orchestras. Classical composers all devoted increasing attention to tone color. The clearest sign of this was the emergence of the classical orchestra. The orchestra standardized in this period formed the basis of the symphony orchestra of later times. The heart of the classical orchestra was still, as in the Baroque orchestra, a group of stringed instruments, violins divided into 2 groups, first violins and second violins, violas and cellos, with a few basses playing the same basic music as the cellos an octave lower. As we saw earlier, there was a basic Baroque orchestra consisting of just these instruments, plus the continuo and various other possibilities, including the festive Baroque orchestra that we can see here. In the classical orchestra, however, the woodwind and brass instruments were given clearly defined roles. With the strings as a framework, woodwind instruments were added. In the high range, pairs of flutes, oboes, and a bit later clarinets. In the low, bassoons. These instruments provided pleasing variety by playing certain melodies and other passages. Each of the woodwind contributed its own characteristic tone colors. They also strengthened the strings in loud sections. Brass instruments were added in the middle range. The function of French horns and trumpets was mainly to provide solid support for the main harmonies, especially at points such as cadences, when the harmonies needed to be made particularly clear. The only regular percussion instruments used were 2 timpani, which generally played along with the brass. The great advance in the orchestra from the Baroque to the classical era was in flexibility in tone color, and also in rhythm and dynamics. The orchestra now became the most subtle and versatile musical resource that composers could employ, as well as the grandest. The Enlightenment ideal of pleasing variety was a secondary issue with classical melody. Rather, the demand was for simplicity and clarity, for relief from the complex, richly ornamented lines of the Baroque period. When people at the time demanded natural melodies, what they meant were tunes, uncomplicated, singable melodies with clear phrases, and not too many of them, melodies with easily grasped parallelism and balances. Confronted with a Baroque work such as Bach's Suite No. 3 in D, a late 18th century audience might have tolerated the fairly straightforward gavotte, but would have been unmoved by the beautiful air. Its elegant winding lines and the mere fact of its great length would have struck them as completely unnatural. In their move toward melodic simplicity, composers of the classical period moved much closer to popular music and some varieties of folk music than their Baroque predecessors had. There is an unmistakable popular lilt in Haydn's music that people have traced to the Croatian folk melodies he heard in childhood. Short tunes, or, more often, attractive little phrases that sound as though they might easily grow into tunes, are heard again and again in classical symphonies, quartets, and other places. Tunes are not the only melodic material to be heard in these works, as we shall see in just a little bit. Nonetheless, by comparison with a Baroque concerto, a classical symphony leaves listeners with a good deal more to hum or whistle as they leave the concert. Often entire tunes were worked into larger compositions. For example, variation form, or theme and variation, grew popular both for separate pieces improvised by virtuosos and for movements in multi-movement genres. Haydn wrote variations on the Austrian national anthem. He also wrote the tune, by the way. And Mozart wrote variations on Twinkle Twinkle in its original French version, À vous dirai-je maman, or Maman, I must tell you. Occasionally, popular songs were even introduced into symphonies. There is one contemporary opera tune in Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, the last he composed. The predominant texture of classical music is homophonic. In classical compositions, melodies are regularly heard with a straightforward harmonic accompaniment in chords, without counterpoint and without even a melodic-sounding bass line. Again, this was thought, not unreasonably, to be a more natural, clear way of presenting a melody than polyphony. All this made, and still makes, for easy listening. The opening of Mozart's famous Symphony No. 40 in G minor proclaims the new sonorous world of the late 18th century. A single quiet chord regrouped and repeated by the violins, the plainest sort of bass support below, and above them all a plaintive melody in the violins. This simple, sharply polarized texture becomes typical of the new style. Homophony, or melody with harmony, was not, however, merely a negative reaction to what people of the time saw as the heavy, pedantic complexities of the Baroque counterpoint. It was also a positive move in the direction of sensitivity. When composers found that they were not always occupied in fitting other contrapuntal parts into their melodies, they also discovered that they could handle other elements of the music with more pleasing variety. In particular, a new sensitivity to harmony was developed for its own sake. One aspect of this development was a desire to specify harmonics more precisely than in the Baroque era. The first thing to go was the continuo, which had spread its unrelenting and unspecified, because improvised, chord patterns over nearly all Baroque music. Classical composers, newly alert to the sonorous quality of a particular chord, wanted it spaced and distributed amongst various instruments in just one way. They refused to allow a continuo player to obscure the chord with unpredictable extra notes and rhythms. It may seem paradoxical then, but the thrust towards simplicity in texture and melody led through the back door to increased subtlety in other areas, notably in rhythm and in harmony. The rise of homophony in the classical period represents a major turnaround in musical technique. For although Baroque composers did write some homophonic pieces, as we've seen, the predominant texture of music at the time was polyphonic. This turning point was, in fact, one of the most decisive in all of musical history, for polyphony had monopolized music since the Middle Ages. Yet it is not the way of history to abandon important resources of the past completely, even when the past is discredited. Classical composers rejected Baroque music, but they cautiously retained the basic principle of counterpoint. They were able to do this by refining it into a more delicate, unobtrusive kind of counterpoint than that of the Baroque era. And there was a sharper awareness now of counterpoint's expressive possibilities. In a texture that was mostly natural and homophonic, counterpoint attracted special attention. This texture could be used to create the impression of tension, of one line rubbing against another. The more intense artificial texture of polyphony stood out against natural homophonic texture. Hence, as we shall see later on, the section in classical sonata form called the development section, whose basic function is to build up tension, typically involves contrapuntal texture. Sonata form was the most important musical form of the time, and so counterpoint was often heard. How can a piece of music be extended through a considerable span of time when listeners expect everything to be natural, simple, and easily understood? This was the problem of musical form that faced composers of the Viennese classical era. They arrived at a solution of considerable elegance and power, involving several elements. First, themes in classical music tend to be repeated immediately after their first appearance, so that listeners can easily get to know them. In earlier music, this happened only in dance music as a general rule. Later in the piece, those same themes are repeated again. Second, themes are led into in a very distinctive manner. The music features prominent transitional passages that do not have much melodic profile. Only a sense of urgency about arriving someplace, the place where the real theme will be presented, and probably presented twice. Third, after themes have been played, they are typically closed off just as distinctively. Often, there are quite long passages consisting of cadences repeated 2, 3, or more times, as though to make it clear that one musical idea is over and another, presumptively, is coming up. Composers would devise little cadential phrases, often with minimal melodic interest, that could be repeated and thus allow for such multiple cadences. Multiple cadences are characteristic and easily recognizable features of classical music, particularly, of course, at the very ends of movements. Two clear examples come from our listening set that we'll get to later on. For example, in Mozart's Piano Concerto in G, at the very end of the last movement, the piano and the orchestra play cadences in fast alternation. The piano plays a cadence, the orchestra plays a louder one, the piano repeats its cadence, the orchestra plays one and sounds even more final than before. Dialogue is a prime feature of Mozart's concertos, and here it sounds as though there is a competition on to see who can get the last word in. Whoever wins, this concerto is closed off in a particularly solid way. In his aria from Don Giovanni, Ho capito, near the end of this aria, the singer sings much the same cadence over and over again. A few seconds later, the orchestra has its cadence and the whole piece is over. We will discuss the entire situation in a later lesson, but here, sputtering with rage at Zerlina, Mazzetto keeps reiterating his sarcastic taunts until he's finally chased away. This cadence, then, is even more solid than it needed to be. For Mozart, a comical effect. A third feature designed to cope with the problem of musical form in classical music is perhaps the most far-reaching. Composers and their audiences came to rely on a limited number of forms, or standard formal patterns, the most important of which are sonata form, minuet form, rondo, and theme and variation form. There was thus a commonly understood frame of reference for composing music and approaching it. Broadly speaking, after listening for just a short time to some new piece, an 18th century music lover could always tell what sort of themes and keys it would include, when they would be returned to, and about how long the piece would last. This frame of reference is not so obvious today, so the 4 classical forms just mentioned will be taken up in some detail in this next chapter. The repetitions, self-conscious transitions, and emphatic cadences that are so characteristic of the classical style all help clarify the forms. And the forms themselves were a special necessity at a time when composers were filling their compositions with contrasts of all kinds. It is a mark of the aesthetic success of classical music that the contrasts don't sound too drastic, because the forms control and, in effect, tame them. The seemingly inexhaustible emotional range of classical music is directly proportional to the extent of those contrasts on the one hand, and on the other, to the elegance of their control by musical form. And so that's where we'll end up talking about the Enlightenment and music. And next week, we're going to start in talking about the symphony. So until next time, cheers.